Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Chip, Robert, Arena,
Des is on.
Desta,
Jane.
Wendy. This is a great turnout. I'm just going to give it another minute. While I'm doing that, just a couple of reminders for good guidelines for using Zoom in breakout rooms. We really want to engage, right, in these World Cafes, as Katie was mentioning. So please use the chat, or you can raise your hand to share your experience. We will invite you to really limit your background noise unless you are speaking. So keep yourself muted unless you're speaking. And then if you can just make sure, it looks like everybody's names are displayed, but please do tell us who you are. And I see that everybody's names are working. So that's a great thing. And I think we have 13 people. So if there are no questions, I think we can get started. But please do raise your hand and use that chat, and then I will help facilitate some of the questions. Thank you.
Great. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Kimberly Pugel. If you were at yesterday's session, you saw me present as well in the collective action session. From a quick skim of the participant list, it looks like most of you were there. So hopefully some of this is a little bit of a reminder to what we talked about yesterday. But again, just to make sure you're in the right table, this is table 2, securing government commitment for collective action approaches. So welcome, everyone. A brief overview of the things we'll cover today. So we have about 15, 20 minutes for this round of the World Cafe, and then you'll get the chance to go to a new one. But we'll have about 10 minutes of presenting all this content, and then have a Q&A section where we'll also open it up for discussion if any of you also have experiences and strategies that you want to share about how you have maybe gained government commitment in your collective action approaches. So the content we're going to cover is some of the background of why we decided to focus this study and some of our lessons around government commitment. I'll cover briefly the investigation that we did before going through the results and some takeaways. I also will note that Lucia Henry is co-convening this table discussion with me. She's from Tetra Tech and helps to lead a lot of the work that I'll be presenting about. And then we also have a few people here from SWS who also have been a part of this work, either directly or indirectly. So lots of experts here at the table. Okay, so getting into it. And I'm sorry, Louis, we don't have coffee or snacks. This is a bring your own coffee snacks table discussion. Okay, so some of the background. If you were in yesterday's session, it was one of our biggest lessons that we shared was that collective action approaches rely on government uptake to make progress. Uptake meaning that key government decision makers are both are carrying out some activities, so allocating budgets, passing policies related to a recommendation or specific activity focus area of one of the collective action approaches. But uptake itself is actually comprised of 2 steps when we really started to think about it. First being them committing to an action, committing to that budget reallocation or committing to that policy enactment. And then the second is actually carrying that out or implementing or following through on those commitments. And in thinking about this, we realized that that second step, even though it's super important, is really reliant on access to financing. And so when we really wanted to reflect on our own work and think about what contributes to that commitment and strategies for gaining commitment or uptake rather, we wanted to focus on that first step, the commitment. So how do you actually get that first commitment from key government decision makers? So what we did, before I get into what we did, just a little bit of some context. So, it's really difficult to gain this commitment. Some of the reasons or drivers of commitment could be that government is an active member of collective action approaches. The collective action approach often provides evidence and demonstrates value of their work. CA approaches gain permission from decision makers before they start work. They also typically support government priorities. Universal wash access in some cases can be a government priority. But some of the challenges to gaining commitment are that decision makers have a lot of priorities. We know that for sure. It also takes a long time for collective action approaches to achieve their intended results. So, it sort of makes it harder to get some commitment. Political reform and turnover, we've talked about turnover a lot, but it can sometimes dissolve hard-earned commitment overnight. And then honestly, in practice, development partners often underestimate the importance of commitment. And so that's also a challenge. So when we started to reflect on how SWS collective action approaches gain government commitment, what we started with was if you were in yesterday's session, you may remember that the overarching investigation had 11 collective action approaches. So we chose 5 of those that were within the SWS Concept 1 concept team to focus on specifically. So we took 5 of those cases and we looked at each of those collective action approaches had multiple focus areas. So the South Ari Learning Alliance in Ethiopia, for example, had 3 focus areas, one on maintenance work, one on monitoring work, and one on master planning. And so we took each of those as a single case for this analysis because they had varying levels of commitment that was gained. So overall, in those 5 collective action approaches, we had 13 cases. The outcome that we looked at was the extent to which they gained significant government commitment from the relevant decision makers. And 8 of these 13 cases gained that, whereas 5 did not, which is really important for looking at the investigation. We wanted to find some counterfactuals. So those 5 that did not gain commitment are really important. And then we looked at 5 factors that have been hypothesized in literature broadly to commit or to contribute to political will and just general government commitment. But these 5 factors were also more emergent, or they emerged through discussions with our team on some of their main strategies. So we did a lot of work to identify these 5 factors. And then just like yesterday's big comparison, or the comparison that we presented on yesterday, we used fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis to synthesize all of this information. So the 5 factors we investigated are here on your screen. In the upper left, demonstrating value was when the coalition convinced decision makers of the activity's value, impact, or urgency. Legitimacy of the coalition was when that coalition, who was the one proposing activities, was seen as a credible, legitimate, and trustworthy entity, which ended up, all of our cases had this. It didn't actually vary very much across our cases, but it was still a very important factor. So I'll discuss that later. In the upper right, having an existing priority. So did decision makers prioritize that activity before the coalition formed? Maybe they prioritized it, but had not yet taken action on it. And that's why the coalition selected it as a focus area. In the bottom right, aligning with clear mandates, did the activities of the collective action coalition clearly fit within an existing mandate of a government entity? And then over on the bottom left, ongoing initiatives. Were there ongoing initiatives such as legislation or programs that were heavily related to that activity topic that were already underway when the coalition formed? So using qualitative comparative analysis, we looked at the role that each of these played in all of our cases. And again, this was something, for a bit more context, this was done pretty closely with all of our partners. Some of the folks even on this table, Desta and Mohammed, are co-authors on this paper that we have recently submitted to the Journal of Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene for Development. So they were highly involved in this process of identifying the extent to which each of these factors were present in all of the cases. So to get to some of the results, we ultimately, and I apologize for the meme, I had to do it. We had one reliable strategy for collective action approaches to gain government commitment. In all 13 of those cases, the ones that were able to gain commitment had these 3 factors, and the ones that did not gain government commitment did not have these 3 factors. So to go through these, legitimacy of the coalition meant that it was critical for the coalitions to be seen as legitimate and credible entities. Typically, they did this by involving decision makers, either directly, as was mostly the case, or indirectly in identifying the problem areas and then regularly updating them on the process and the different challenges they were encountering. Transparency and consistent messaging were also prioritized during discussions with decision makers, which really helped contribute to credibility. All of the collective action coalitions had formal memorandums of understanding, and many had terms of references, documents that were signed that before they started their work or shortly in the beginning of starting their work. The conveners of the coalition, typically the hub, but whoever it was, they had good reputations in the locality. They demonstrated long-term commitment. They gained permission from higher levels of government before starting activities. So there was a lot of work that was done by all of these groups to make sure that they were seen as legitimate and credible entities, which was really important for the government believing what they were doing was valuable. The second was making sure that the activities that they decided what they were going to focus on were actually aligned within clear mandates. So that was important because coalitions who are working towards improving public services are by definition seeking to work in domains where government is the legally responsible entity, right? So their efforts should align with the mandates of the government. This idea is particularly well established in the Ethiopia and Uganda WASH sectors, at least where our cases were working. One of the pillars of the Ethiopia One WASH national program is alignment with government mandates. So this isn't a particularly new idea, but one of the things that this study is showing is that in order for collective action approaches to gain that essential commitment from decision makers, they should also make sure that their activities align within and in support of existing mandates. And then the third condition that was also needed for gaining commitment was demonstrating value. So we all know that governments, and particularly local governments, have a lot of responsibilities and competing priorities. So to get their buy-in for a coalition's focus area, it was really imperative that the coalitions showed decision makers how the activities would make a significant impact. So one way that they did this was using comprehensive systems assessments to reveal leverage points where single WASH interventions could lead to wider change in the performance of local systems. And these technical results were typically followed with advocacy to convince decision makers that those leverage points were urgent and impactful and valuable. And then in addition, relationship building and trust between the government and the coalitions also gave some weight to those issues that were revealed in the assessments. So I guess, oops, I meant to go back. So, one of our biggest recommendations and things that we'd like to hear from you as well on your thoughts on this is that, we would recommend that collective action groups make sure to use these three or support these three factors in their work. But we also have a few other takeaways and recommendations. Like one that is really interesting is that if you remember, we looked at 5 factors and only 3 resulted as particularly influential. And the 2 that dropped out of the analysis were the ones related to existing priorities or existing efforts, which would be particularly susceptible to turnover or political reform. And so because those 2 dropped out of the analysis, it's actually really interesting or a really interesting takeaway is that commitment can be gained despite turnover and shifting priorities. The second takeaway is a point that I mentioned at the very start of this presentation, that commitment does not guarantee action. We talked about uptake being critical, and commitment is only the first step. Actually following through on those commitments is a very important second step, which we didn't really look at. And then the third is that having a working knowledge of local dynamics is really critical, specifically knowing who the correct decision makers are, who should be targeted with, or whose mandates should activities fit under, who should value be demonstrated to. And so that's also a really important consideration. So thank you. I will just share, you've seen the flagship report that's linked over there on the left. And we also shared the journal article that is the wider study. But as I mentioned, this third resource, we did just submit earlier this week a manuscript to the Journal of Water and Sanitation for Development that is currently under review.
Great. Thank you, Kimmy. So we only have a couple, like 2 to 3 minutes here, but we have a first question coming in from Lewis, and he'd really like to hear what the country-based practitioners in the room think. And I know we've got a lot of people here from SWS, so I would love to hear your insights, Martin, Muhammad, Jane, and anybody else that would like to share. So maybe, Martin, are you there? And if not, maybe Desta, can I call on you?
Yeah, thank you, Amy. You see, this collective action is really very important. At the end of the day, whatever the donors, the implementing partners is doing, if the government is not uptaking and if they are not really uptaking or showing the commitment, after the project or the program is phased out, still nothing add any value. So the main important is how we bring the government to convince them to uptake or make a commitment to take over as an ownership. As a project or a program, it is working at the time for 5 years or for 10 years, and forever the government or the decision makers are there, and they have to take over and build the ownership to take forward. So the main important is, as a coalition or a collective action, our main objective is to convince the decision makers or the local government to bring them as the optimum level of showing the commitment. We did a lot of research. We are working with them to just have the sanitation facilities as the local level. So this is the evidence. We just tell them as an expert, we don't have the resource, we don't have the ability to just decide, but they accept that decision, they show the commitment. And if I take the Deborah Brand, there are really tremendous amount of money that are allocated within these 2 or 3 years because of they understand, they talk over, they make an ownership. So we hope, and even after our final Learning Alliance, they are committed to continue with the Learning Alliance and make institutionalize and allocate the resource and even make give the responsibility for different wide sectors. So they are very committed. They are very honored to accept what the collective action or the Learning Alliance is recommended to them. So the main important thing is to bring the level of commitment of the government by advocating what was there and what the action and what the theory behind that. Thank you.
Chip was commenting on thinking that like the way that this approach is from non-governmental to governmental actors, and he was suggesting another approach is investing in areas where government commitment is present. I think, you know, we've learned a lot, and a lot of that is included in this research, but Kimmy, maybe if you can comment on that a little bit more to clarify that.
Yeah, and I also think, you know, Martin, with CC's comment right after you, Chip, who you said you think you were saying similar things. So Martin was one of the co-authors on this paper, and he was sort of saying how, and this is, you know, he's been saying this for years. This is not necessarily new, but he has spearheaded the idea that because government is ultimately the one who's responsible for providing services, especially, you know, in the WASH sector, especially in Eastern Africa, where mandates for service provision are decentralized. So local governments are the ones who really hold that responsibility. And because they have so many priorities, so many responsibilities, if you as a collective action approach can be directly helping them fulfill their mandates, directly helping them do what they're supposed to do, in the words of Martin's comment there, you know, that is just so helpful. You know, Martin has worked a lot with the Cabarroli District Council, who oversees a lot of the work of the District WASH Task Team, which is their collective action approach there in Cabarroli. And they essentially, if they can go to a district councilor and say, yes, the work of the District WASH Task Team is helping you fulfill your mandate of providing universal water access to your rural population, then it's just so that person can just feel like they're help that group is helping them fulfill their mandate and do their job, which has just been really, really critical in some of our cases. So, you know, I guess to your point, Chip, and I don't know if you want to elaborate on it a little bit more, you know, I think that in other sectors, and certainly there's a role for private sector in WASH services, WASH service delivery. But at the end of the day, government, especially in Ethiopia and Uganda, where these cases and this knowledge was generated from, government is just so critical to being involved, or to their buy-in is just so critical. Yeah, Chip, go ahead and add on to your comment. I see you raise your hand.
Yes, well, thanks. Well, just a clarification. I was using venture capital here in a sort of a metaphorical sense. We have, you know, limited development resources, and so the question is where to invest them most effectively. And so the point I was trying to make is perhaps standing back and sort of looking at where we can support collective action. You know, what we're ultimately about is that collective action is a means to achieving the end of sustainable wash systems. You know, where are the factors perhaps the most positively disposed to achieving that end, and beginning there, you know, and presumably that would include government commitment. And the point so I mean, it was a question, I mean, obviously the research that you conducted, and I think clearly the factors that you identified, I don't have any quibble with, but I was just saying that the results of trying to get government involved at a sort of a second step, perhaps sort of thinking about sort of the system as a whole and the government's, as you were rightly, you know, as you were indicating, the government's role in it from the beginning, and looking to where you can leverage that commitment from the get-go. And the only point I was making at the end is that frequently, you know, I have seen where one bright spot, like a district or something that has achieved something, provides both competition and incentives and assurance to others that this is in fact feasible.
Okay, so yeah, you're talking more about like if, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I was interpreting what you're saying as if a collective action approach, like at the start of it, before it even starts, that they should try to identify areas that already have commitment from government and work in those areas. Yes.
I mean, I mean, obviously I'm putting my donor hat on, and so I'm saying, you know, if I've got a limited amount of resources to invest in sustainable wash systems in a particular country, you know, could we do assessments to sort of find out where the opportunities are the most apparent, and start, you know, sort of start there and sort of use it as a way of perhaps getting a snowball started, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super interesting. I know in some of our cases that a big challenge that they face is that if you had started from that point and asked government what they've already committed to, or what things that they really are focusing on, a lot of them would say infrastructure expansion rather than system strengthening. And so a lot of our partners had to do a lot of work at the outset to convince decision makers of the importance of system strengthening, you know, of working on strengthening or standardizing maintenance, like maintenance service provider models, or working on certain policies, rather than just dedicating a bunch of money and time towards just expanding existing infrastructure. So I think it is a balance, and I think it's super context specific, like you were saying, and that we've talked about a lot in this Closeout learning series. So yeah, but that's a really great perspective. I see we have a few other comments in the chat. Amy, I'm not sure if you got to to look
We
through those?
do, yeah. I just wanted to quickly address Robert. Yeah, absolutely. We started SWS with pre-COVID, and our colleagues in the field have really had to deal with a number of challenges, including COVID, election cycles, security situations. And so we do know like how challenging that can be and to adapt to systems programs. It's a great question. And we'll definitely pose that to our colleagues and share their response with you. We also had a question from, I don't know, C. McGahey, and I didn't know if you wanted to pose that question. You had 3 questions. One is on indicators for including the approach in a field program. I don't know if would you like to come on and share a question that you have, or Kimmy, if you understand the first question. Maybe we'll go to the third one. You've mentioned several times that government commitment is critical. Is it a useful gate that field activities may pass through before other activities happen?
I can give you background, Amy, if you want clarification. This is Chris McGahey. The first one has to do with USAID structure. Chip made a real compelling argument earlier about not having uniform indicators. But we all know USAID projects are driven by the indicators that they're provided with. And so that's what that question was about. Is there a utility in having an indicator so that projects can move in this direction which you've laid out? The second one, your slide, as I said, there was very painful. You had a table full of men. And is there any field experience you've had in obtaining government commitment and making sure that equity is part of that commitment? And then the third one is just your opinions. You've said several times that government commitment is critical. Many organizations view it as a gate. If you don't get government commitment, you don't go anywhere. And so I was curious of whether you viewed it that way. So that's where those questions were coming from. Thanks for taking them.
Yeah, and I'll also, Lucia, if you wanted to jump in on all of those. I mean, I would just say the first about indicators. That was one of our key recommendations that we presented in yesterday's session, and again, this is specifically for collective action approaches, not for all development work, right? And so, there are some things, like you said, government commitment is seen by a lot of implementers as a gate. I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just saying that specifically for collective action approaches, we are also finding that, which is a generally more understudied and more emerging area. So one of the things that we were saying is that for collective action approaches, one key indicator, because government uptake is so critical, a indicator of progress might be able to be government uptake, like you were sort of saying. About the picture with all of the men, this was one of the learning alliances. They actually are women. I think one of them is hidden. It is a predominantly male group. I don't know, Lucia, if you wanted to comment on that, since you help facilitate or help manage the work of this learning alliance. But there are women in it. This was just one of the photos that we used. But I appreciate the comment, especially coming from a male person. So yeah, I think that we've tried in a lot of our photos and just this closeout event and learning series to include more women.
So Lucia, did you want to
Just very briefly before we get booted off. Thanks, Chris, for that question. I think for government, yes, it is a gate. They have a mandate for these services to deliver these services. So I don't think we can work around them. I think it is critical. They have to be part of this process. And I think, if we are working in a country like whether it's Ethiopia or it's Uganda, we know the role and the power of government. There is no way you can move forward without them. So yes, I just confirming what you were saying about the MENA gates. The picture is a bit of I must admit, it's a bit of an accident. There are women in the learning alliances. I think from the onset, our colleagues certainly tried very hard to bring more women into the process. It's a little harder in sort of patriarchal societies where, the relevant representatives are male. And so what we were finding is typically the women were coming in from sort of the Ministry of Health or the Office of Health. They were tended to be sort of the environmental health workers. And make no mistakes, they had a very strong and active role in the Learning Alliances. It's just a pity that that picture is not very representative of what the Learning Alliances look like. We do have stats certainly for the Ethiopia Learning Alliances, and I would have to go back. I don't think it was as high as 50%, but it was certainly more representative than it looks like in the photos. So. And with that, I'll end because I think we're about to be booted off.
Yes, we are at the end. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Kimmy. Thank you, Lucia. Thank you to all of our partners who contributed to this great work. And thank you for your wonderful questions. We appreciate it. And we look forward to hearing from you soon. You're going to get another email blast that has these as in addition to recordings. So we look forward to hearing more from you, and please check out our reports. Thank you.